In this session, we're going to have a look at liquidity ratios. In other words, the short-term health of a business. And we're going to have a look at these ratios to help us assess the short-term survival of that business. Really, we're thinking about cash and the impact certain assets and liabilities have on our cash balances. So when we think about liquidity, we're thinking about how quickly a business turns assets into cash. So how quickly we take inventory and sell them to create a receivable, and then a receivable, how quickly we collect that receivable to generate cash, and then we're going to spend that cash to buy assets, so inventory, and see that cycle going round and round. So we're really seeing how quickly a business turns its inventory and its assets into cash. So, first thing we're going to have a look at is what's known as the current ratio. And that we take our current assets in our SFP and divide them over our current liabilities. What that is going to give us is X amount to 1. Okay. So do we have enough current assets to pay off our current liabilities as they fall due? Now, a company should have enough current assets to give a promise of future cash to come to its suppliers or its payables. And we must have enough current assets, quick assets, short-term assets, in order to be able to meet those current liabilities. Now, usually a healthy current ratio is normally 2 to 1. So normal is 2 to 1. So we have twice the amount of current assets to settle our current liabilities. Okay? So we've got more than enough or twice as much assets as what we have liabilities. Okay? And that would be considered a healthy level of current ratio. Now, essentially, anything less than 1 to 1 is very worrying. If you have less current assets, inventory, receivables, and cash, than you have current liabilities, well, then that's going to give you a big problem. And that's going to worry your trade payables or your suppliers. You must have more current assets than you have current liabilities in order to meet those short-term payable commitments. Okay? So a healthy current ratio is normally 2 to 1. And again, the larger the current ratio, the healthier the business is. So 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1 would be considered very good. Anything less than 2 to 1, and certainly anything less than 1 to 1, would be very worrying for the survival of the business. Remember, included in current assets is your cash. And remember, we said with cash flows, if you don't have enough cash, you don't have a business. One of the most important ratios that you'll learn. Now, current assets then are inventory. Inventory you need to sell in order to create a receivable. Your receivable you need to recover the cash in order that it turns into cash. Okay? We call that the working capital cycle. We purchase inventory on credit, could create a payable. That inventory we need to sell to a credit customer, a receivable, in order to get the cash, so then we can use the cash to pay off the payable. And it's going to go round and round in a circle, working capital cycle or operating cycle. So, the only problem with that is we need to think about inventory. Now, inventory has to turn into a receivable before it turns into cash. It's the least liquid current asset. It takes the longest to turn into cash out of all of the current assets. And as such, we might want to calculate another ratio, the quick ratio, in order to be able to take out the inventory, the least liquid current asset, and show how many of our other current assets, receivables and bank, we have to pay off our current liabilities. So, our next ratio is the quick ratio, sometimes known as the acid test. Now, some businesses may not be able to turn their inventory into cash quickly. If you imagine a house builder or a construction company, their inventory would be their houses, their work in progress, and even finished goods or complete houses. Now, it takes a while to go through a house sale process. It might take a few months. Well, if it's going to take you 3 or 4 months to turn that inventory into cash, well, then that's going to be quite a slow-moving process to get from inventory to cash. And remember, current liabilities are short-term payables, okay? So a current ratio may be great for most companies, but for companies that have slow-moving inventory, like house builders, it might be better to calculate the quick ratio, where we take the current assets and minus and strip out the inventory and then divide it over your current liabilities. Now, ideally, we're looking at here of anywhere from 1 to 1 higher, okay? So do we have an equal amount of receivables and cash to meet our current liabilities? Anything in excess of 1 is expected. Anything less than 1 to 1 is worrying, okay? You have less cash to pay off your payables. Now, one of your payables might be a bank overdraft. And bank overdrafts are repayable on demand by the bank. Well, if you don't have enough receivables or cash to pay off that amount on demand, well, then that's really worrying, okay? Especially worrying for your bank, okay? So the quick ratio really is stripping out the slow-moving inventory and showing quick cash and how our quick assets turn and cover our current liabilities. So 1 to 1 or greater is considered healthy. Anything less than 1 to 1 is considered worrying. Okay. So how quickly can we turn our quick assets into cash and also to cover our current liabilities? Okay, moving on then, we're going to have a look at our efficiency ratios. Now, how efficient are management in turning inventory into cash? In other words, how long do we need to keep inventory for in the business? We're going to start off with the inventory days. Now, this is going to express the number of days on average a business holds inventory for before selling it and then generating the cash. So what we do is we take our closing inventory from the SFP, divide it by cost of sales, and then multiply it by 365, the number of days in a year for most of the time. That's going to give us the number of days on average in a year the inventory was held for. So what's going to come out of this ratio is the number of days. The number of days on average we hold our inventory for. Okay. Now, of course, if it's, let's say, a supermarket's inventory days would only be 3 or 4 days at the maximum because they sell perishable goods. But if we go back to a house builder, their inventory days might be 365 days, 400 days, yeah? Well in excess of a year, because they have a slow-moving inventory because it is the nature of their business. So really it depends on the type of business as to what is considered a healthy inventory holding period. For most businesses, no more than 30 days. But for construction companies, for house builders, inventory holding period could be well in excess of a year, and that would be considered normal. But let's say then, let's go back to a supermarket, that the number of days on average they hold their inventory for is 60 days. Well, that would be worrying, wouldn't it? Because they sell perishable goods. And as such, if your inventory days are too high, you have a higher risk of your inventory becoming out of date or obsolete. Even in the fashion industry as well, fashion retailers, they would like to have their inventory holding days of no more than a few months. Anything in excess of that, well, again, they have that high obsolescence risk, and therefore they might have some large inventory write-offs as a result. Now, if it's too low, well, we can't see that as being too much of a problem, apart from the fact that if you're holding your inventory for such a short period of time, you run the risk of running out of stock or inventory, and therefore your sales might slow down as a result. Okay? So if your inventory days are too low, you run the risk of having stock outs, not having enough stock to meet demand. Now, the other important point to note is if you do hold your inventory for too long, well, all of your cash is tied up in that inventory, which, remember, needs to be sold to create a receivable, and then that receivable needs to pay. Now, that might be 30 to 60 days later. So you don't want your inventory days to be too high, or else a lot of your cash will be tied up in that stock, which you then need to sell in order to generate cash. And again, you might sell it on credit, which would take even longer to get the cash. We'll have a look at how this works and how we can interpret it later on when we look at an example. Our next efficiency ratio is how efficient we collect our receivables, the receivables collection period. And by doing this ratio, it's going to tell us the number of days on average it takes us to collect our receivables balances. So, it's going to give you the number of days on average to collect receivables balances. Now, what we do is we take our receivables balance at the year end and divide it by our credit sales. Now, if you haven't been given credit sales, using total sales from the SOCI is absolutely fine as well. We multiply by 365, the number of days in the year, and that's going to give us the average number of days it takes us to collect our receivables. Now, for most businesses, we would expect that to be 30 days. But again, if you think about a retailer, so let's say a supermarket, you would expect their receivables days to be almost zero, because you walk into a shop, you buy the goods, you then pay for them straight away by cash, or maybe even for credit card. And as such, the receivable would be the amount of time it takes to receive the money from the credit card company. 2 or 3 days. Okay, you would expect the receivables days to be quite low for a supermarket. You don't walk away and say, oh, I'm going to pay you later, because you'll have the security guard running after you, won't you? So, again, it depends on the type of business. 30 days are normal. Anything in excess of 30 days would be quite worrying. Okay, so maybe if we've got a normal commercial business, okay, and normal credit terms of 30 days, if in average in the year it takes us 90 days to collect our receivables, where's the credit control? Why is it taking so long? Okay, if our receivable days are in excess of our credit terms, that's worrying. You know, where is the credit controllers? Why is the debt not being chased? If receivables days are too high, that could also lead to a risk of writing off irrecoverable debts, which would then be written off as an expense and would affect your profit margins as a result. Now, equally, if your normal credit terms are 30 days and it takes you 10 days on average to collect your receivables in the year, well, maybe your credit controllers are being a bit too harsh, or maybe your credit terms themselves are a little bit too harsh. Okay? Or it can just show that management are being very efficient in collecting their receivables. Okay. Now, other reasons why the receivables days may have increased is maybe that to win new business, management have decided to extend the credit terms to new customers. That could be a legitimate reason as well. But again, it depends on the type of business and the credit terms that they offer, so we can decipher whether those receivables days are expected or normal, or if they are worse or better than our credit terms, but also compared to the prior year. These ratios are only useful if you've got something to compare them to, usually last year's results. Okay, so these ratios will only have meaning if you have something to compare them to. And usually that will be last year's results, an industry average, or maybe a similar business within the same sector as yours or a competitor. Now, our final efficiency ratio is to do with payables. And our payables days is going to tell us how many days on average in the year it takes us to pay our payables. So, again, this is going to be number of days on average it takes before we pay our payables. So how long do we wait on average before we pay our suppliers? And for that, what we do is we take our payables on our statement of financial position and divide it by our credit purchases. Now, if you haven't been given credit purchases in the exam, purchases as an expense would be fine, or even cost of sales if you don't have that. So usually it's credit purchases, but if you don't have that, purchases as a whole or even cost of sales would be an appropriate denominator. You multiply that by 365 and that's going to give you the number of days. It will always be 365. I appreciate that there's not always 365 days in the year, but it's just an approximation and it's absolutely fine to use for the exam. Now, again, it will be useful for us to compare the average number of days it takes us to pay our payables against our suppliers' average credit terms. Now, if it's 30 days credit terms, let's say, well, as a result, if, let's say, our average payable days are 90, well, we're taking too long to pay our suppliers. Is that because we don't have enough cash? Well, let's look back at our quick ratio and find out. Or is it because we don't have enough long-term finance? So maybe we haven't got an awful lot of long-term debt. Or sometimes we need a bit of debt to pay off our payables and to keep our business running. If it's too high, it's a very serious issue. Okay? Obviously, we may not have enough cash to pay our payables. Now, if, let's say, the payables days are lower than the credit terms, well, maybe we're taking early settlement discounts. Well, that's fine. Okay? If it's less than expected, you know, we're quite happy with that. Okay? But again, if you are paying before the credit terms, well, maybe, again, that's an issue to do with the amount of cash in your business. Maybe you're paying your payables too quickly, and therefore you don't have enough cash to buy more inventory, let's say. So there's various different reasons why your payables days on average are going to be higher or lower than last year's, but also your credit terms. But you've got to be careful. You do not want your payables days to be too high, or else you're going to really upset your suppliers. Therefore, they may not want to supply goods to you. And then that cycle, that operating cycle stops. You don't generate the revenue. Well, then that causes a big worry in the business. These ratios are really important. You could get tested on any one of these in isolation in the exam. We need to learn these ratios, and we'll apply them to an example in a couple of sessions' time.